Arches are a great looking and common architectural feature. But because we find them on walls, they are affected by whatever perspective is on that wall. So how does this affect arches, and how does this affect the way we draw them? The answer is quite simple. So let's have a look at it. When we look at an arch, the most obvious thing is that it's half a circle. And a circle fits in a square. Now, a circle in itself is a more difficult shape to understand how it's impacted by perspective, but a square is a much more straightforward shape. So let's say this square was in a wall, and the way it looked with the perspective on that wall was like this. It's easy enough to get our 4 quarters, and we know that a quarter of the circle fits in each of those. And here we have our circle affected by the perspective on this particular wall. Now for an arch, of course, we only need the top half of the circle. So we only have to worry about the top 2 quarters of our square. The important thing, however, to notice is that while in our square, each section of the diameter of this circle is the same length, once our square is affected by perspective, that's no longer true. So this quarter here is the longest, and this quarter is the next longest. This quarter is going to be the shortest, and this one the third longest. So, and of course the sides of the arch are no longer lining up on the horizontal. Let's see how this goes then when we're just thinking about an arch and not a circle. Another point worth noting is that if we look at the curves in each side of our quadrant of our arch, this closest curve is a much fuller curve, a much rounder curve than what we get in the other quadrant. Can you see the difference? Over here, it's more like this as opposed to this quadrant where it's more like that. An arch window. That we're looking straight on at. So let's say this window is affected by perspective. We're going to have something that looks more like that. But of course it depends on not just how much our wall slopes away from us, it also depends on where our eye level is in relation to this window. But by visualizing the arch section of our window as sitting inside 2 squares, it gives us the diameter of the circle, and it also gives us where the ends of the arches stop and the straight sides of the windows begin. When the wall is moving away at a very steep angle, then our arch is significantly distorted. The other important thing to remember with arches and perspective is the principle of foreshortening, which is that as an object moves away from us, a visual compression takes place, an apparent narrowing of the width between elements on our wall that are in reality equal, whether they're windows, whether they're gaps between windows, whether they're columns. Because if we picture our archway as sitting inside 2 squares, the second square is actually going to be slightly narrower, slightly compressed because of foreshortening to the first square. So we don't want to have our division right in the center of our two boxes, but we want to shift it slightly in the direction in which the wall is moving away from us. And the steeper, the further proportionately this center line moves to one side. Let's look at this real example. Here we have the perspective angle of where the arch meets the vertical sides of our window. And if we go to the top, we can see that the center point of our arch sits very slightly to the left. And again with this one, but it sits relatively further to the left than this one because the foreshortening has increased because this window is further away from us than this window is. And unfortunately this lamp stops the scene that this happens again, that this pattern is increased in the third example. Here's a great example of a row of increasingly foreshortened arches. We can see the perspective angles that our quadrants sit within, and we can see how as the arches move further away from us, the roundness becomes narrower and narrower. The ellipses, of which this is half, flatten and flatten. And this curve becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. And we can certainly see the foreshortening, the visual compression. Even this arch, just 3 arches away from this one, has visually compressed to less than half the width of this one. My approach is to draw the first couple, the largest, closest ones, as accurately and as carefully as I can, and then just generally try to capture the pattern, which in this case is keeping between the perspective angles, getting the foreshortening correct, and making these curves pointier as we move further down the street. So no need to be afraid of arches in perspective. We simply need to think in terms of circles fitting inside squares. So if you haven't used this way of thinking before, why not give it a go now? Have fun. Bye.